feels really special to me to be sitting next to these two amazing waihingi tour from the unemployed movement in the 1980s. Yeah. So, but I want you to hear from them, not from me. So I just want to start by asking, perhaps you first, Jane, telling us a little bit about yourself and how it was that you came to be involved in the unemployed workers movement.
Kia ora e te whānau. Ko aura ki te mauka, ko waita ki te awa, ko taki te miti waka, ko tahi pō te ki te takata, ko rua heki te hāpū, ko kaitahu, taku iwi, ko tāpuna taku marae, ko James Stevens taku ingoa. Yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a bit actually, and this morning's been an amazingly rich conversation. And thank you, Jim, for talking about pepper potting, because I've never heard anyone talk about that before, and I realised in later life that's exactly what happened to our whānau. So just going back to the 60s, I grew up in Dunedin, so this is Kōwaio, who I am. And our whānau were pepper potted into the Andy community, which was kind of a really strange experience for us. So we're like whānau that kind of lived between two worlds, you know, and back in those days, being Māori was something that if you didn't look Māori, then you didn't talk about it. And for my dad, there was an element of his life when we were very young where that was the case, where the advice was just don't do that. But in fact, we were still treated as Māori by Pākehā, and often by Māori by Pākehā as Māori. So I didn't know me really, so being pepper potted into that community was pretty horrendous. And there were 6 of us, I'm the only girl, so that tells you a little bit about my journey, having to marshal the troops all the time. And my mum was very ill, she was epileptic, so I was mum from a very young age to my brothers, and the youngest of those 2 brothers, those 5 brothers, were both disabled. My mum had a heart attack at birth, giving birth to triplets. And yeah, so it was a pretty hard place to be growing up, but a place still full of love. And I come from a very strong, working class union background. My dad, at one point, was the vice president, I think, of the Dunedin Trammies, and I remember just. Also the strikes that were going on as a kid, that people bringing kaya around, and one thing that sits in my mind was my dad and the shame I could see on his face when he had to accept money from strangers, just to put food on the table. So there's, it's lovely to kind of make sense of that. I guess people would say I was a little bit wayward. As a teenager, I was part of that slightly later movement of young Māori going into the cities. I ended up in Wellington, within the gang scene in Wellington, and we were able to actually set up a work cooperative under the TP scheme for young Māori women in the Wellington gang scene, and that was revolutionary for me on lots of levels, and it was a big part of why I ended up in the unemployed workers movement. It was the first time we really had a voice, and with the world in mainstream being actually, for me, a very dangerous place, and people find this hard to accept, that the gang movement was a whānau, an urban whānau for us, a place to actually belong. So, with all its dangers, it also was the start of my politics, Bob Māori. And at the end of, it was about 1980, Nobody's allowed to ask me any questions that rely on remembering dates. Okay? It's just not going to happen. We were working as a very strong collective. We had the Women's Work Trust and the Men's Work Trust working on the council and the Education Board, and we started to work with the unions in Wellington, particularly the guys working on the dust carts. So lovely to hear Rod's story this morning in the labourers union because of the sorts of conditions that we were experiencing as workers on council. I became a leading hand, which was like, my first real leadership role. And then I think the first action when the government announced that the TEP schemes were going to be cut and putting, I think it was about 15,000 people out of work, just bang, was we organised a picket down at the FOL and Jim Bolton was coming to see Jim Knox. Therese might have been there. And I have this lovely memory of all the Black Power guys running down Luke's Lane, chasing the parliamentary car of Jim Knox, looking white as a sheet, as he got out of the car, but they were really just running because they were late, not because they were chasing him. So that was my introduction, really, and I just want to acknowledge Therese, actually. I was hoping she'd be here today because looking at the movie and some of the kōrero this morning, we kind of, Sue and I, came next, the fact that as young women we were able to take leadership roles within a new movement. I didn't really at the time, it wasn't something that we took account of, I don't think. And I never look at it as if I had a choice to be involved. It's just what I had to do. It was about that social justice and making sure that we did have a voice and that we were sick of being mucked around. And and in Wellington in those days, just that started that support coming around us that actually start to organise. Amazing.
Kia ora, Jane. Kia ora koutou. I'd really like to acknowledge Jane and Cybe, part of our old unemployment movement, and you, Therese, and anyone else here that was part of our movement back in the day. I'm not sure, there might be people here I don't recognise, because of course I was much more up in the north. And thanks for including the unemployed workers' struggle in this history session today. It's fantastic that we're part of it, because we were. I grew up in Auckland in a very different background to Jane's, white, educated family. My father was a scientist at the university. But my home life wasn't that great. I became very political when I was an early teenager, joined this is late 60s, joined the Progressive Youth Movement, which was like the Communist Party youth branch in the late 60s, and got very heavily involved in the movement against the Vietnam War. Left home when I was 16 and walked under quite a rough life for quite a few years. But I did go to university and ended up as a journalist here in Wellington by the mid-70s, but just after that, I lost my job, I lost everything. I ended up as a solo mum on the DPP with twin babies, and that, in some ways, I suppose, is one of the reasons I ended up in this movement, because of how we were treated, how women like me were treated back then. And I know the treatment now is bad, it's probably just as bad, but the institutional treatment inside the hospitals in there was just incredible. Just treated so badly as a sole mum. And then tried to get, as my babies got a bit older, trying to get back into the workforce, even as a really educated white woman. There was just no way back into work, and so I began to feel that anger, the raw anger of unemployment, of what it means to know I've got all these skills, I'm really well educated, look at me, I'm white, all the rest of it, but because I had two babies, there was no way in. So the raw anger of unemployment was there. Then we hit 1981, and a lot of you would have been there, and the country divided into half, and my political energy was totally revitalised. And I think a lot of us, I was on the front lines, I was arrested many times. I was with Bill, who some of you know from the union movement, Bill Bradford, and by this time we were married and we were on our way to having another 3 children. So we were bringing up children right through these years, and with Bill we ended up unemployed as a family, which is a whole other experience as well, what it's like being out of work and trying to raise a family on the dole and having only barely enough to get food, which of course that hasn't changed either. So in very early 1983, Bill and I were part of a small group of people who sat around on our back lawn, and decided, really maybe had a strategic discussion about where best to put our political energy in this time. And looking at the situation with unemployment going up on the back of, this is early 83, there was no unemployed workers fight back group in Auckland at that time. There were a lot of people we knew out of the Springbok tour who'd gone into the work around the Treaty of Waitangi and had become very strong on anti-racist and treaty work, but they'd driven people like us out because we were communists, and it was almost McCarthyist the way we were driven out of the Waitangi groups at that time, because class and race were that was McCarthyist, and so we thought, okay, we're not part of that, but we totally understand the colonised nature of this country and what's happening for Māori, and that Māori are actually the worst off alongside Pacifica brothers and sisters. And unemployment is an issue which affects us across all these lines, as women, as men, as Māori, as Pacific, as Pākehā. So where is the very edge of struggle? So that small group of us called a public meeting which set up the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre. And I think we're going on to the unions next, so I'll talk about that in the next piece.
Well, you could talk a little bit about the formation of the Wellington Unemployed Workers Union, or you?
As I said, that I think the start of the Unemployed Workers Union was really from there we actually set up an action committee, started working with the union people that we knew, and I was so lucky having people like Trace and Wendy Davis there to keep me sane, because actually it wasn't easy being a woman. And I think what actually held me strong was that I was so used to living in a male world. I wasn't going to take any crap. But it was still really hard, because you go to things or the media would come and they'd automatically go to the man. Like all that crap was going on, and it was just so incredibly frustrating. And we were still dealing with the very hierarchical, old school way of organising from the union movement. We're going on to talk about that, but it created a dynamic. We were trying to do something different, trying to do something that was non-hierarchical, that was by the people, for the people. And I think what was really exciting about it was that we were actually going to have, we were creating a voice for ourselves, that we were actually taking action for ourselves, not other people doing it on behalf of us. And the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of that, was all there. But I think that's why it worked, setting up the Unemployed Workers Union. Therese was just telling me before the day that we had the naming day, Wellington Unemployed Workers Union, which shortcuts to woo-woo. And rolling around in hysterical laughter, and particularly kind of thinking about, well, the unions are not going to like that. Happy to say that. It was a pretty amazing time, and I became the coordinator of the Wellington Unemployed Workers Union, and the work was huge. The development of that organisation, and then the Hutt branch, the Porirua branch, Puru and Puru. You know, that was kind of the foundation for us in terms of starting to branch out and work with other communities around the country. We talk about that after, yeah.
What is that talking about the unions?
Well, it's really about how our group, the Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre in Auckland, started, because how come we went to Auckland Unemployed Workers Union like them? Because we looked to them, we looked to Jane and the people in Wellington and the groups in Palmerston North and other places that had started a right earlier, and we could see this huge gap in our big city. So we really looked at them as an example, and so this is basically, we'd hoped to set up an Auckland Unemployed Workers Union. But the night we called our first public meeting, over 100 people came to the Pitt Street Methodist Church Hall in Auckland already. It was the church, Methodist church there that offered us the space free, which was amazing because we had nothing. We called a public meeting and were amazed at how many people tuned out. We had a lot of support. What's hard to realise these days is how huge unemployment was as an issue. People actually cared about it. People were ropeable. People from all walks of life, and it was like, how could this be? How could this country come to this state where we had over 100,000 people unemployed? Look at this bastard Muldowney, won that 81 election through the Springbok tour. The anger at Muldowney, the residue of the militancy of the Springbok tour was still with us. And in the unemployment that was hitting people becoming redundant, but also young people not being able to get working. And so that anger was palpable. So we were having our rip-roaring first public meeting, and we were halfway through it, and a representative, some of you might remember Pat Shepherd, came over from the Trades Hall, from Trades Council, from the trade union meeting that night, and stood up in the middle of our meeting and read out a statement from the Trades Council, Auckland Trades Council, saying that tonight we have established the Auckland Unemployed Workers Union to be the representative of unemployed workers in the Auckland region. And so we were left, okay. So we, of course, we didn't stop, we carried on, but right from that start we were really in a terrible position, because any unemployed person or beneficiary that we talked to in the region was going to say, why are there two unemployed groups? And this was our first experience of working in the unions. They wanted control of the unemployed union in their city, and they did not like us upstarts. We were just a ragged, rugged group of all sorts of people claiming autonomy like that we could do it ourselves. Sorry. Yeah. So that's where it started, the difficulties with the relationship with trade unions, and the next 16 years with the saga of what came from that.
Yeah, I was at that meeting, and I think it was the first time I'd had any experience of the brazenness of that kind of behaviour, and as Sue says, it continued on, unfortunately. And I think, while in Wellington, there was a foundation of relationship with the trade unions, and so there was, there's some really good people within the trade unions themselves, but as a movement, and particularly with, I have to say, Bill Anderson's influence, that was impacted hugely by the factionism that was going on. And I mean, for me, I think one of the most hurtful occasions where that was, I won't go into them all, was when he, and I think Ken Douglas, went to government with David Longy in '84 and said, the Te Rōpū Rawakore can't represent the unemployed, we want you to pick someone to go to this economic summit that you're having from our group, because they're just a bunch of stirrers and commies and all the rest of it. And that was when Pat Shepherd got chosen, I presume by Locke, just to keep the peace, to attend there, and where that kind of undermining of us when we had set up a national movement, the undermining of who we were and what we were doing, and that inability to actually support a grassroots movement which, when I look back, we did some amazing stuff. When you think about how hard it is to organise unemployed people, such a diverse group of people we are and were, how spread out we were, how difficult it was to communicate, it was pretty amazing. And we needed as much support as we could get, and it was pretty tough when the very people who you look to and who you feel you are part of are the people that are stabbing you in the back. I think, if I think about regrets, I think, why do we spend so much time bloody fighting each other, wasting all that bloody energy on that shit? The divide and rule crap. And combined with that, that we were a group of workers who, were where Māori and women were coming to the fore, and it's lovely to see Kinleith, because, to me, the richness of that was the woman and the manaaki, the whānau, coming together. I mean, that could not have happened, if it was just your state old bloody Jim Knox's, banging the gravel on the table. People wouldn't have come around it in the way they did. You wouldn't have had a movement like you had there, and even though, I don't know that people really kind of got that in some of those kind of higher echelons of the trade union movement, and for what it actually was. And then, we kind of came next, unemployment started becoming a real issue. And as we still considered ourselves workers, but I think that was one of the problems, that we were actually a threat to people, or seen as a threat to people who still had jobs. And the trade union movement, they didn't know how to deal with us largely. And I'm not saying that, because there's a whole lot of people in this room that, from the trade union movement, that have been amazing. So this is just kind of, broad brush. But we were kind of a problem, and that the SUP dealt with it in a particular way. Somebody decided the night that a new organisation was going to be set up that they'd better do that, and spend a lot of energy undermining us. And to our credit, we survived it. Lots of grey hairs, but yeah.
So Te Reo was an amazingly vibrant movement. So tell us some more about it.
Well, really, James, yes,
We divvy it up. I was there at the beginning to the middle, and then you were the middle to the end. So I think, it was an amazingly vibrant movement, and I think for the reasons that I've talked about, that there was a lot of manaaki, whanga, whanga, we were all engaged together. We tried to be non-hierarchical. We tried to be open to change. We were dealing with people with all sorts of backgrounds, and so it was never going to work unless relationships were really high up on our agenda in terms of building sustainable relationships that could survive difference of opinion. And in 1983, so there were a lot of groups starting up around the country that we started to, and me in particular, I guess, that started to go and work with around the country, like that asked us to come, the established people from the established groups to help new groups get set up. And so, the strategic thinkers amongst the groups, were starting to look at, well, we need to, develop a more collective voice on a regional, national level. And in 1983, we all met up at Ruapehu in the ski chalet on the mountain, and set up the national movement Te Reo Kore o Aotearoa. Although it wasn't called that at that point. So that in itself was amazing. We had the same scenario happen there as well, with the Auckland Workers' Union arriving with their edicts about what we could and couldn't do, and they decided to set up a regional neko Kinleith. So, you know, again, that vibrancy was tested in terms of having to deal with this kind of external undermining all the time. And I think we also had a sense of humour in what we did. We were creative, you know, like we had lots of street theatre going on. We had people on PEP schemes. You know, I heard people talk before about the whole kind of, you know, the communication, the way we communicated was so much different. You know, with the steppers and political posters, and then in Wellington we had the media collective. You know, that was an absolute talent when I came back. You know, that we were able to produce all this amazing artwork. So there was a whole lot of creativity going on, but a whole lot of serious advocacy work, strategy development work, structural development work, and you know, a lot of the base of that was around how we actually change the way in which we work so that Māori and women have an integral structural place of equity. Now, I'm not saying that was perfect, it certainly wasn't. It had a whole journey in its own right that we were working through, but I think, you know, one of the things that I still think about is the generosity of the people, you know, particularly from Mama Taipa, who hunt Moniroa in particular, you know, the generosity of the people to actually work alongside and develop something that had some cohesiveness and unity, and I think that was you know, in all of its forms, it was a real treasure. I want to add.
Oh, kia ora, Jane. Yeah, well, the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre was very much, right from the start, very keen on being part of setting up a national movement, and I think one of the things about this era, which a lot of you are old enough to remember, but younger people I work with these days just can't even understand or imagine that we had up to 31 unemployed beneficiary groups around the country, like this plethora of organisation happening on the ground. Our groups were all really different from each other. Some of our groups, like ours, were very militant, out on the streets, a lot of organising demos and occupations, and really on the front lines of action. Whereas other groups, right through to groups in places like Fielding or Invercargill, who were not militant in that way at all. But we were brought together by a common set of goals around no work for dole, about full employment, enough to live on, whether you're in work or out of work, so benefits and wages. Our slogan was jobs at a living wage for all, and that goes right to the heart of the economy and the fight against capitalism, basically. And so we were brought together into this national movement, which worked for a number of years. As Jane said, Mana Taipa, which is a small marae up near Manamuka in the Hokianga, the people from there had a tremendous influence on the movement in terms of our beginning to understand and grapple with working across Pākehā Māori, working together in ways that were effective, meaningful, what that meant for our groups. I'll never forget the Mana Taipa people, you'll probably remember, storming the Hui, the National Hui, here in Pōneke in 1984. Oh yeah, you're all right. How it started was Pākehā leaders of the Hui were sitting up the front of the room in classic trade union formation with the minute taking and the motions, and then the Māori at the back suddenly, halfway through they just said, no way, we're not going to operate like this, and they just marched out, great big whānau, and marched out of the room, off to another room, and said, if anyone wants to come and join us now, Hui, come along.
They come down on a bus.
Yeah.
On a bus float.
And so that was the beginning, like they so challenged us right up in the heart of what was going on. And up in Auckland, where of course are much closer to us, and we ended up for many years actually working really closely with the people from up north, from Kaitaia and Hokianga around there. And I'm living back up near Kaitaia now, and yeah, the links are still, yeah. And Yeah, so that brought it, I just have to tell you, one of the worst things that happened really for us, in, like Jane, I later on became the national coordinator for Te Rōpū Rawakore o Aotearoa, and so like you had to wear the front of this of having to use that name, and it was a very, very difficult name because Rawakore for many people means like scum, like people that are just don't want to know. And I rapidly, as my knowledge of the language improved a bit, I began to see that our name should have probably been Koromari. But our name was given to us. Like, I was in a room when it happened, and this is one of these things that you can't do anything about. Our name was given to us by Korea from up north, and that was it. But we had, I'll never forget all those years of having to explain on our eye and that, like, why we called this. Yeah, I don't know if you found that, but
I think the queer probably had some deep roots in that we did, in terms of, when you think about the way in which people are put down, it was about changing the meaning, into something that had some money, and maybe that was our challenge from them to turn it, and I think we did, actually. So, yeah, I think when I hear it used today, I don't think it has those particular connotations either anymore. It wasn't easy, but I mean the gift of it, I think, still felt like something that was pretty special that we've been given. And yes, that I just, from that first challenge, I think it's a tribute to everybody there, the relationships that grew out of that, and the changes that grew out of that. And I think initially that sort of being caught in ways in which trade unions expected, that was quite a significant change period of time that we actually found our own strength to be who we were.
Tilda, looking back on those evolving relationships between Pākehā and Tangata Whenua in Te Rōpū Rawakore, what can we learn from those, do you think, in terms of those relationships and the struggle for tino rangatiratanga that continues?
I think one of the hard things is about people giving away their power. I think it's still true today. I certainly still experience that. And I think it's a question we still have to confront again and again and again in everything we do. I think that was certainly one of them. Because even though, it was a starting point, it still did not, we still did not get to the point in which Māori had equity, and we still are not there. And I'm working more in the mental health field at the moment, and we're still going through those same things. And one of the things that I saw happen recently was like stuff, actually, like that whole kind of scenario where they sort of fessed up to their racism and like, whoa. That is movement, but at least it's actually continuing to happen, and I think in any movement going forward. There's the hard stuff, and I look at who's in the room today as well. That actually hasn't changed a lot.
I think for those of us working in the unemployed movement in the 80s and 90s, as we went through, we learned a tremendous lot from the from the struggles inside our groups, but also working externally as well. Probably one of the most intense probably still is the most intense political experience of my life, and I've had many, was the March Against Unemployment vote in 1988, and I don't know if any of you came and supported that when we were marching through Punaki, but Te Rōpū Rawakore had called this hekoi from the north from Te Hapua to Wellington, There was also a South Island unemployed group job search tour, but it was the Hikoi that I was part of. And it really was a brutal experience. As shortly after we started to call for this march, a group of mainly Māori communists from around the Rotorua area had also decided to have a march, and so the two groups came together. There was no choice, of course, we should come together and march with and for unemployed people. But it turned into 3 weeks on the road, on marae after marae, with the Communist Party part of the march in almost total physical control of everything, doing what we saw as really unethical things with marae and koha and stuff on the way through, trying to wipe us out in terms of having any voice. It was only saved because in that respect, because I was one of the spokespeople, and they had a spokesperson, but their spokesperson would start giving a lecture on capitalism and Marxism to the media, and so after day one they never talked to that person. And so that was, we managed to keep just the slender strand of political, like this is what the march is about, in the front, but on the marae, and sometimes it was up to 3 marae a day, we'd be arguing inside about the politics of it, and they'd be trying to wipe us out. And by the time we got down here, after 3 weeks, it was a very grim little fighting force that was left from the Rotorua inside that march. But we got bigger and bigger as the numbers joined us as we came south. And we got a pretty good march on Wellington on Parliament, I think. And really, that was the first time I ever debated the cabinet minister. I debated Phil Goff on unemployment that night, and things like that make you feel like it's worthwhile. And I feel like that we might have stopped work for the dole happening through the Maumai march. So I don't think it's for nothing. But I guess why I've told that long story again, well, it's a very short version of it, is that the lessons that myself and a few other friends learnt on that march was like how as a Pākehā, like how important it is that we don't give up. Like, yes, this is the reverse of how having power taken from you, because power was taken from us from day, every minute of every day. But that actually, if you stand for what you believe in, as we did on marae after marae, if we stand and fight on street after street and keep saying this is what the march is about, we're fighting with and for the unemployed, this is not about how many flags the Communist Party has on the field in the streets, which is what it was for them. This is about unemployed people and holding your own in that. And it's been interesting for me in years since then, occasionally I've run across some people that were on that march, and they said to me, like they treat me like I'm their best mate or something. But I think that it's the fact that you stand up and keep standing up and holding your ground and being as ethical as you can inside the kaupapa. And so that taught me a lot, and of course some of you know I later had the experience of one or two people here of being in mana. And some of that came back of what it's like being a Pākehā left person inside a Māori focused organisation. And these are lessons we all need to learn if we're going to make this country, if we're really going to build it. If for us Pākehā that want to build a strong response and be a strong partner, we have to not only subjugate us, it's not a matter of subjugating to Māori, we have to be able to build our own strength in a way that we are a respected and respectful partner, not that we're just sort of a guilty little Pākehā, wandering around the edges. And I think that's the big lesson that I learned from all that.
Yeah, just to add, as I was talking, just made me think of the hui that we had in Westport when we were setting up our two-race model. So we had a hui of Māori unemployed workers, and we managed to get the government to agree to pay people who were on PEP schemes and pay for people's travel to Westport from around the country to attend this hui. And we got $5 grand out of the government to hold it. And it was an amazing hui actually. I mean, it had its issues and challenges and people coming from different places, but it was kind of a really big step forward for us. And But unfortunately, the good people of Westport didn't like the idea that all these unemployed Māori were coming into their town. And a story started to circulate that we had taken $5,000 of government money and spent it on booze, and we're having a boozy weekend. We were on a marae 17 k's out of town with kaumātua, you know. Like, it was total fabrication, but it became a thing. And it went through the Labour Party, Whetu, started relaying back to Wellington. The Truth newspaper got hold of it and did a huge big story on it. And I was so angry, I just demanded a meeting with Kerry Burke, who was the Minister of Employment in Whetu, Tirakatni Sullivan, and walked in there and slammed these accounts on the table. And they realised at that point that the damage had been done. It had gone right through a Labour Party conference. We were so vulnerable in that sense. That our best efforts could be so quickly undermined. It took 6 years of suing Truth newspaper to get them to actually do a retraction. 6 years. That was what we were up against, and particularly anything to do with Māori.
Jorga, you've told us a few stories already, but I wondered if you could both reflect on some of the key achievements of the unemployed movement in the 80s.
I think you didn't go away. I think that was a big one. We actually, looking back, it's incredible that movement happened, and it lasted for as long as it did. It took the journey that it did in terms of exploring, ways of living biculturally in our country, women's leadership, how we actually create a voice for an incredibly marginalised group of workers in this country. On the smell of a woolly rag, essentially. There are a whole lot of, there are a whole lot of campaigns that we're engaged in that I think were wins. One that I think of is what we used to call the Bludger Buster Patrol. And that was where they actually went into beneficiaries' homes and interviewed people to make sure that they weren't ripping off the system, and they had a set of questions. And we managed to actually turn that around. We had a campaign, with beautiful posters that the Media Collective had put together it was actually me dressed up as a cop from the 80s with a long baton, bashing these beneficiary families. And we set up a campaign so that we reversed it, so that we actually held the meetings in the unemployed workers union offices. We had copies of the interview questions, and we met with the family first, so they knew what was going to be asked, and we made the social welfare workers come into our environment, and we questioned them. And that was so empowering for people, but so disempowering for the social welfare staff that they managed in the end to put a stop to it. But it was a pretty awful process that they were putting people through. So there were a lot of things like that that we did a lot of advocacy work on a one-to-one level. We did a lot of advocacy work with the departments, and we did a lot of advocacy work regionally and nationally with Parliament. And I think in context there were many achievements along the way. And in spite of the environment that we were working in, it was tough.
Kia ora, Jane. I'd just like to talk with everything you've set up. The fact that we survived, that so many groups did keep going. There was always a coming and going of groups, but some just kept going. in Auckland, the Auckland Unemployed, our group, the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre. What we did in the 80s really laid the base for what happened in the 90s, which was the development of the 3 Auckland People Centres, which in the end Wellington Unemployed Workers Union also set up a People Centre down here. So building, we learned from the 80s the importance of actually of being real, that we had to do more with and for the people we worked for than just be political and just provide beneficiary advocacy at what was then the Department of Social Welfare. That really provided medical, dental, a whole lot of other services to people. And the top
Haircuts.
What's it?
Haircuts.
Yeah, haircuts, green dollars, the employment support, council. We did heaps and heaps of different things. And so the people centres in Auckland at that peak, we had 14,000 individuals accessing our services. And that was a self-run, autonomous organisation the fees that people paid $10 a month per family, that helped in turn keep the unemployed rights into the political wing going. The thing here was having the services and the politics together. But all that came off the base of the work and the learning that we'd done in the 80s. It didn't just come out of nowhere. And likewise, I think in terms of militant action and the ongoing through the 90s of the coalitions around things like the 91 fighting the benefit cuts in the ECA in 91. At least up north there was a really strong alliance between our groups and at least some of the unions, and really those really big marches in 91 and then on into the big coalitions we built in the 90s around the Asian Development Bank, the Chobham, the APEC meetings, things like that. Right, there was a lot of learning that got taken into the 90s, which made those 2 decades really different than what's happened since 1999, which was the year that we very deliberately closed the Unemployed Rights Centre down. It took us 6 months off meetings because it was such a huge thing to shut down a group with such a history as what we've been through. But by the end of 99 we made the decision.
Kia ora. For me as a student in the 90s, being unemployed and then meeting Sue and getting to be part of the occupation of the Reserve Bank, I think demanding full employment to be the #1 agenda, I think had to be up there as one of the most amazing experiences of my life. So, the Reserve Bank occupation. Linking arms with Bill Bradford and singing a lot. Yeah, so bringing back memories for me too. I guess one of the other questions we had here that maybe we could ask before maybe opening up to the floor for a couple of questions. Yes, we've got 15 minutes left, yeah. So the other question we thought about was, do you have any regrets about what things that didn't happen?
Tracy's going to sing. I think for me, the biggest one is what I started talking about was, the sectarianism that we try and how much energy that drained, and what could we have achieved if we all been actually on the same waka going forward, because and in ways like how do we fall into that trap? Because it is, like it's encouraged by those who don't want us to be effective. That's probably the thing that immediately comes to mind, and how could we make sure that going forward that doesn't happen again? Or that probably is still happening, but not so much. Yeah, it was pretty dominant in those days. So it's probably, the biggest regret I have.
Yeah, it was, this is saying, I just think, oh gosh, I wish we'd been kinder to each other across some of the lines, or had a way to communicate better with each other than drunkenly fighting in the union bar. That's where the SUP and us,
It's them, not us.
It was pretty bad. It was really bad in Auckland. But in the end, we all became friends. The Auckland Unemployed Workers Union and the Auckland Unemployed Workers' Rights Centre joined together as one organisation in 1988 and went on the equally the march against unemployment together. So that was a happy ending, as it were. But yeah, we were so rough and so, but it was such a fight for survival. We were fighting for survival in our own families, in our own, for young people without families, for them as well. I think I've often thought that one of the things that made groups like the one down here and ours and others really strong was that we actually had a lot of family people, women and men who had children. Well, we were bringing up 5 young children. But because you're doing that, you're really in touch with what life is like for ordinary people. Whereas a young 18-year-old unemployed person is quite a different, like the groups that are run by those, just by young single people, are really different than the ones where there are a lot of women and families involved. And that sort of led to the people centres and things like that, when you're thinking about everybody, not just yourself, really. So the regrets, yeah, I wish we could have been kinder and reached across to each other better. But I've actually, just in the last 24 hours, because I've been thinking about this, the converse, of course, of not having the left sex, all the vibrant, different ideologies and groups around the town, is that we hardly have anything like that now, if anything. I don't know the Wellington situation, I don't want to insult anyone. But what instead, the last 20 years, we don't have those groups, but we don't have the analytical and strategic thinking. We don't have the people who are committed to putting their life into going into the freezing works or the pulp and paper mill or the unemployed workers movement, as some of us did back in the day. Those were deliberate choices that as socialist economists we made to go and work in these organisations, and we put our lives into them, some of us, because that's where we thought the peak of the struggle was, and we're and in all different ways. All of that's gone. So that's the converse of losing sectarianism. So can I say, my dream is that we have a left organisation that isn't sectarian but is able to do things like that.
Shall we open it up to the floor?
The Congress League, what was its role?
They were around. In fact, I was accused of being a workers' Congress League member because my heart was, but I never was. And I think it's interesting because I actually was really down on that idea of left-wing people going into factories and working with the rank and file. And that's because I came from that place, and I felt that people should be empowering in other ways the rank and file to actually take their own power. And I think that's what we actually did. We were able to do it now with the workers' movement, moving on to that. So.
Well, thank you, Paul. I was on the British Communist League. Kia ora to former comrades in the room. And certainly that was part of that's the sectarian politics in Auckland. Though the WCL in Auckland was really different than the WCL down here, from my experience, of a very different kind of organisation. A lot smaller up in Auckland. We also had people from other groups. We had SGP people inside our group, so it wasn't like a party grouping in the Unemployed Rights Centre. We had a lot of people through there, and most of them were not WCL, and there were a lot of anarchists, a lot of other socialists, and people that didn't come from any of those backgrounds. We had a lot of people from the churches, from the left of the church, the liberation theology. Right from the start, we had far more support from church people than we did from trade unionists. And that was always really important for us in the Unemployed Rights Centre. So we ended up, by the end of the 80s, we had a group called the New Vision Group, which was actually quite large, with around 30, up to 30 people. A lot of them priests and nuns and people from church, heavily church backgrounds, and us that were called the heathens. And actually going real deep into politics and theology and economics, like really sharply, doing real sharp analysis. And it was out of those kind of meetings and crossings over that we began to move towards things like the people centres. So we came a long way. Yes, we started, some of us at the Young Rights from the Workers' Congress League, but we were just a fraction of it. But I'd say an influential fraction.
Where did you get the funding for the organisations?
A potpourri of places. So there were at different stages of the movement's life. It was coming from different places. You know, there was short periods of time where we had some government funding after the Labour government came in. We would do all the usual community organisation fundraising. There were some unions that contributed funding, but it was a largely volunteer organisation. So you know, a lot of our work was done by people who were volunteering. For a period of time, we were able to use PEP schemes. So we had people employed on those and project work. So yeah, like wherever we could, essentially. But we were never a wealthy movement. No one could accuse us of doing that.
Yes.
Thank you both for all this. It's been really interesting. I was wondering, I mean, unemployed people as a group are obviously quite transient because, you know, then people move into work. I'm just wondering, like, how the movement kind of managed that, and, you know, who stayed on and how it worked and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It is difficult, but I mean, in a sense, you know, our goal was for people to be able to move on, to find, you know, employment, and I think it was part of the psyche that we and anyone who works in a volunteer organisation will know, you know, how you kind of got to manage around that. So there were often like a smaller group of key people who kept things going. And then, I mean, I actually think it was something we were actually good at doing, you know, actually bringing people on board and actually engaging them in things. And Sue's talked about the people centres, but there were, you know, over the years, a lot of the centres were doing things like running food cooperatives. We had some businesses even who were providing services for people who were unemployed, or discounts and vouchers. And, so there were quite a lot of, you know, initiatives going on that we were drawing people into in different ways around the country. Some groups would run their own, like second-hand shops, for example. So yeah, it was always tricky, and I think it still is tricky. But that was the basis of what we were doing. That you know, journeying people through over a year.
It was always a problem, and it is what makes organising with unemployed people and beneficiaries so difficult, because mostly people want to get work in the paid workforce, and mostly our groups couldn't pay people, and so we would get waves of people, and working in our group like ours was often a great way for people to get some current work experience and to get their confidence back, and then they get work. And that's the best outcome, but meanwhile the rest of us that were left behind are going, oh no, we've just lost so now we're doing all this, what are we going to do now? And so that's reality, and also the waves of governments, noticing how when Labour comes in, often Labour sucks out the people from the movements, because and now the Green Party as well, it sucks out its activists, even into Parliament, and leaves the movements behind. And so having some people that can hold the group together, so that while those waves of people go through, that's the really hard part, and that's where it was comparatively better access to both job schemes in the 80s and later to other kinds of funding in the 90s, meant that we could keep the groups going in a way that's just impossible now. Like, some of you will know I was part of setting up and running Auckland Action Against Poverty, which was kind of like a new unemployed version, a new version of the Unemployed Rights Centre that we set up in 2010. As national hits were coming in again, and we just looked around and thought, man, you know, like this group, we haven't been here, we have to come back. So we came back with a whole new generation of young people, some of us old timers, and started all over again from scratch. And of course, the history of the Auckland Action Against Poverty since then has been very tough, because the funding now is just impossible. Like, if you've got anyone in the community sector will know. So, yeah, it's not an easy thing. They're much, much harder these days.
Yeah, and actually one of the differences back then was that funding was usually organisational based. So if you were actually able to access funding through the philanthropic sector, it was based on the operation of your organisation, and now it's based often around the service you are providing, a particular service, and that has meant that, yeah, like they can get, for organisations that are doing advocacy work, that makes it extremely difficult, because all they want is to contract a particular service, and they sure as hell don't want to contract your advocacy.
We are coming to the end of our time, but we are about to move into lunch. So for those of you with bringing in questions, can come and ask, if that's okay. But nā mihi miharu kia kōrua. Thank you for sharing with all of us. I wanted to do something brave and sing the unemployed anthem to acknowledge the end